Apparatus is a social category. Disability has existed as a signifier that constitutes those designated with the label as outsiders, other, foreign entities that face significant challenges in being recognized as fully human subjects. In this, autism has not fared any better, with autistic individuals often facing similar forms of social struggle in their day-to-day lives. However, autistic individuals contend with unique barriers in their interactions between the institutions they come into contact with. These confrontations with neurotypical social formations creates a repression for the autistic subject, a repression that is specifically derived from ideology. In delving into this repression, an analysis of special education in conjunction with Louis Althusser's study of ideological state apparatuses will yield us a critical viewpoint on what it means to be truly autistic. Louis Althusser was born October 16th of 1918 in Algeria to French Pied Noir parents. Today, Althusser is regarded as one of the most important thinkers in leftist discourse. Althusser's influence derives mostly from an essay he wrote named Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, where he elaborates upon the Marxist concept of ideology. Althusser does so by extending it further than Engels' original interpretation of ideology as false consciousness, which argued that in a capitalist society, the working class can and sometimes will co-opt the interests of the rich to the workers' own detriment. An example of this would be a retail employee voting in favor of trickle-down economics rather than a more redistributive model that seeks to reform the material conditions of the working class. However, even in saying this, Engels does not truly investigate the why or how of false consciousness. This is where Althusser comes in with a structuralist analysis of ideology. However, before getting into Althusser's contributions, a quick word on ideology. Ideology, as used here, is not referring to political ideology such as being a liberal or conservative, or concerning certain schools of thought. Rather, ideology is referring to the production of ideas, concepts, and consciousnesses by the superstructure of society that imposes itself on individuals at the micro level. Here, rather than ideology staying as an external force, ideology instead pervades the subconscious of each person, with each individual then reproducing ideology within their social formations. For example, think about the rhetoric regarding those on social programs, with ordinary people criticizing those on welfare or disability benefits as lazy or good for nothing. Here, those individuals who attack the welfare recipient have internalized messaging from the superstructure on behalf of the base and reproduce that messaging on a much more intimate level, thus performing the job of the superstructure as ideological beings. Here, ideology is not only an external force, but also something interior that pervades your consciousness at every level. It is as philosopher Slavoj Žižek says, ideology is our natural state.
Herr Žižek, was zeigt der Film?
The movie shows how ideology functions actually in our daily life. What do I mean by this? Two things I love in this scene. First, it's the opposite of what we would have expected. Usually we think ideology is as glasses which distort our vision, and to see reality you have to take off the glasses. I like this gentle, refined reverse that here on the opposite, it's the correct thesis of the film. Ideology is our natural state, and to see the truth you have to put on the glasses.
So, what is the how or why of ideology? What is the process by which consciousnesses are produced? Why is ideology so pervasive? And how does it operate with not only the psychological structures of the individual, but also the institutional structures of society? This is where Althusser's theory of repressive state apparatuses, ideological state apparatuses, and interpolation comes into play. Here, Althusser extends the Marxist concept of the superstructure into two categories, that of repressive state apparatuses and ideological state apparatuses. Repressive state apparatuses are the institutions that threaten violence if you disrupt the order of our society. So, think about prisons, the courts, police, structures of society that make sure an individual is removed if they pose a disruption. You can think of repressive state apparatuses in terms of the protests over the death of George Floyd. Peaceful protesters, journalists, and bystanders were swept off the streets by federal officers in unmarked vans as a result of their association with a movement that sought to disrupt the status quo of racial injustice. The repressive state apparatuses react to the disruption of the status quo by removing the individuals that are causing that disruption and putting them into our courts and prisons. Ideological state apparatuses, on the other hand, act to prevent this disruption of the status quo from happening in the first place. These ideological state apparatuses do so by providing mediums by which individuals can internalize the dominant ideology. Here we can take a look at mass media such as TV or film, religious institutions through places of worship, the structure of the nuclear family, and education through schools and universities. All of these structures, as ideological state apparatuses, play key parts in producing the worldviews of the general public, and as such are deeply ideological. Films tend to have a latent political content that endorses capitalist ideology. Religion has been turned from a radical institution into the structure that pushes prosperity gospel and televangelists. The nuclear family teaches the passive acceptance of hierarchy, while the educational system indoctrinates its students with a social education that is directly linked to its role as a factor that converts young children into able workers. The institution of the school itself is of specific interest to Althusser. On the role of the school, Althusser writes that the school takes children from every class at infant school age, and then for years, the years in which a child is most vulnerable, squeezed between the family state apparatus and the educational state apparatus. It jumps into them, whether it uses new or old methods, a certain amount of know-how wrapped in the ruling ideology, or simply the ruling ideology in its pure state. Somewhere around the age of 16, a huge mass of children are ejected into production. Each mass ejected en route is practically provided with the ideology which suits the role it has to fulfill in class society, the role of the exploited, the role of the agent of exploitation, of the agent of oppression, or of the professional ideologist. The mechanisms which produce this vital result for the capitalist regime are naturally covered up and concealed by universally reigning ideology of the school. Universally reigning because it is one of the essential forms of the ruling bourgeois ideology. An ideology which represents the school as a neutral environment purged of ideology, where teachers respectful of the conscience and freedom of the children who are entrusted to them by their parents up for them the path to the freedom, morality, and responsibility of adults, by their own example, by knowledge, literature, and their liberating virtues. This is all to say that the school, through systems of ideological indoctrination, constitutes, or makes up, our various psychologies and notions of personhood that we view to be free expressions of ourselves. This system of ideology is, of course, not questioned, because we are conditioned to view school not as a vital cog in the broader ideological machine, but rather as an independent bastion of learning that produces children, not as able and obedient workers, but rather as academics that learn the essence of critical thinking and liberal virtues. Due to this belief of ourselves as not subjects of ideology, but rather as free individuals, we do not question the ideological state apparatus, as we don't see the ideology right in front of us. The ideological state apparatuses have, metaphorically of course, ingrained a self-censor into our psychologies that prevent us from seeing ideology as ideology. It is like the film They Live, the movie Zizek talked about earlier, as an example of ideology. We see advertisements or other ideological structures as mundane or devoid of ideology, but once we remove ourselves from that natural state of ideology and put on the sunglasses, we can see those structures as pure ideology. This process of internalizing ideology is what Althusser calls interpolation, or to constitute by naming. Althusser's famous example of interpolation is through the process of hailing. Imagine you are walking down the street in a crowd of people, and a policeman suddenly yells from behind you, "Hey, you there." We can presume that you and those around you would turn around and recognize the policeman in some sort of submissive manner, whether that's by freezing or putting your hands up. However, Althusser views this recognition of the policeman as one pervaded by ideology. The reason you turn around to face the policeman is not necessarily out of pure instinct or reaction, but out of an ideological basis by which you recognize yourself in relation to the policeman. Here, a thought process begins which states that I am a citizen who should follow the laws, and thus, I should be obedient towards the cop demands as they represent the law. In this interaction, the individual recognizes themselves as a citizen, and thus as a subject, a relation that is created by the internalization of ideology. We can also think of interpolation in a different way. Take Althusser's conception of the school as an ideological state apparatus. How is the classroom within the school typically structured? With desks and tables clustered together, focusing towards an area where a standing teacher or educator lectures, right? Here, by having the teacher stand in a focused designated area in front of the student, where the student oftentimes will have to literally look up to make eye contact with the teacher, it interpolates the student as a subject by which ideology is imbued into the structuring of the classroom itself, creating the teacher-student relationship as a hierarchy of authority rather than a more equal relationship, thus discouraging the student from questioning the facts and ideologies the teacher espouses. This is interpolation, where the ideology imbued into the structures and institutions of society constitutes the individual as a subject of ideology. So, we went through Althusser and ideology in a hopefully straightforward and efficient manner, but what does any of this have to do with autism or disability? What kind of insights will an ideology critique of special education yield in regards to students with disabilities that are positioned as ideological subjects? How does special education interpolate autistic students? And what does this interpolation have to say about autism as a mode of being? In asking this question, we have considered the role of the school in forming the identities of autistic students. Fundamentally, if we are to accept Althusser's argument that the interests of capital pull throughout the apparatus of the school as ideology, and that this ideology ultimately constitutes students as obedient and productive workers, optimized for efficient labor, then we have come to the conclusion that the role of special education is to put in motion a process of making individuals with disabilities hate their own disabilities. The logic is this. A capitalist firm, when all things are equal, want to maximize profit while operating at a low cost of labor. In hiring employees, disability tends to come into direct conflict with this philosophy, as accommodations and ADA protections tend to add to labor costs, while potentially lowering the productivity of the firm when utilizing workers with disabilities. In a vacuum, it is not within the best interests of the for-profit firm to hire employees with disabilities. However, the reaction of capital is not to see the labor power of workers with disabilities, but rather to use the interpellative power of the educational apparatus to mold individuals with disabilities in order to reduce the inefficiencies of those workers. How do schools do this? They do so by locating special education students within specific relations of power, while pushing an educational and symbolic curriculum that situates disability as a negative that one must disassociate from in order to fit into the broader social order of their community. Within the special education classroom, educators teach students that their disability is something that must be minimized to the extent that is possible. Autistic students face this through the form of social skills classes, which engages in an instruction which seeks to minimize autistic traits while championing neurotypical characteristics. We can see this take place through the special education classes' repression of autistic mannerisms, where students on the autism spectrum are regularly given lessons on how to perform as neurotypicals, hiding their autism as a negation of normalcy while being taught that their neurodivergency is something to hide. Further, this instruction is compounded by how special education is positioned within the symbolic relations of the classroom. In the classroom itself, the authority is represented as a symbol of neurotypical hegemony, the same hegemony which is sprinkled throughout the curriculum of special education by the presence of the teacher who almost never has disability, creating a classroom hierarchy where the non-disabled teacher acts as the educational authority, while the special education students perform as subjects of ideology within the framework of the classroom. In addition to this, think about the actual location of special education within the physical layout of the school itself. The special education hallway is typically isolated away from the rest of the school, with the student body typically having a general knowledge of that hallway being the special education hallway, or a classroom being the autistic classroom. What this isolation does is effectively other the autistic student. It creates a us-them dichotomy, where the autistic student is recognized not as part of the collective student body, but rather as an individual effectively alienated from that social community, creating a barrier between those who are considered normal students and special education students. A separation that is both metaphorical and physical due to where the special education classrooms are located in the layout of the school. What this separation, enhanced by the already existing stigma surrounding disability, does is further encourage individuals to disassociate from their disability, from their autism, and regard it as a thoroughly negative disorder which causes disadvantages for them in multiple facets of their lives. Whether that's through integrating into the social order of their community, feeling isolated and performing as students in academics, or even in being treated as fully human subjects. Through this system of ideological interpolation, processed through special education, we create autistic individuals who have been taught to hate their own autism and have encouraged them to start to disassociate their identities from their own autism. Further than this, the disassociation from disability continues into the special education students' entry into the workforce, an environment which is becoming increasingly dependent on the workers' ability to build connections with people of power within their specific fields. The one concept that has been ingrained into undergrad job searches is that networking is one of the most important things you can do. How do autistic individuals fit within this evolving economy where more is being asked of the worker's ability to accumulate social capital than ever before? Perhaps the answer is that they just don't fit, that they lack the compatibility with the modern work world due to their autism and instead fall through the cracks. Autistic individuals are becoming increasingly aware of this reality as they transition from their adolescence into adulthood, with studies regarding the startling rates of unemployment of autistic individuals with college degrees becoming public knowledge. This reality of autistic individuals showing their aptitude in critical thinking and intellectual tasks, as shown for their ability to graduate college while being drastically underemployed, yields a conclusion that it isn't an issue of the competence of autistic people, but rather an issue of their autism being not compatible with making it in our modern job economy, meaning that they have to disassociate from their neurodivergency as much as possible, ultimately resulting in a repeat of the lesson taught in special education. How then are autistic individuals supposed to come to positively identify as autistic? They don't, and instead regard their own disability as something to totally reject in order to better fit within the logic of capital. So, okay, through various systems of ideology, autistic people are deprived of opportunities to conceive of their disability in positive ways. So what? What is the solution exactly? A lot of the criticisms I've levied is tied into the power of capital, and outside of a radical reconstruction of how we govern ourselves economically, the issues presented are not likely to change. Because of this, the solutions I do offer will come across as very liberal and insufficient, but I do contend that they are part of the puzzle as we build towards a emancipatory politics for the disability community. Here, I think we need to use the ideological nature of special education for our own usage, but rather than allowing special education to interpolate their students as less than or inferior, we can utilize it as a vehicle for counter-narratives surrounding disability to emerge. For example, not once in all my time in special education did I learn about the 504 protest or Helen Keller's advocacy for disability rights. What I did learn was about the disabled subject being some sort of inert individual who was acted against and consistently failed to react in their own interest, rather than being an individual who acted ferociously for their own self-agency. By giving the autistic student counter-narratives, ideologies that cast people with disabilities as individuals filled with agency, we give our disabled youth opportunities to yell "fuck you," to identify boldly and defiantly as autistic, as disabled in a world that seeks to cast such identities as hollow existences.
The harassment, the lack of equity that has been provided for disabled individuals, and that now is even being discussed by the administration, is so intolerable that I can't quite put it into words. I can tell you that every time you raise issues of separate but equal, the outrage of disabled individuals across this country is going to continue. It is going to be ignited. There will be more takeovers of buildings until finally maybe you begin to understand our position. We will no longer allow the government to oppress disabled individuals. We want the law enforced. We want no more segregation. We will accept no more discussion of segregation.